Morning. So on this occasion, we're going to discuss the main subject that we are learning currently in this kolel, which is hilchos mikvahs liyuna. The Rabbi Shraga Kolel, of course, gives Baruch Hashem and gives shiurim, practical shiurim. I'm not here to be masigvul, but just to fill in some gaps on some episodes, some stories, history relating to some of the discussions in hilchos mikvahs, and to give a bit of an overview of those historical those historical incidents, those halachic discussions in those cases. So on this occasion, I'd like to discuss an interesting chapter in the history of Yiddishkeit, keeping Yiddishkeit in America, before all the yeshivas finally took root and all the, what you'd call today, Haredische communities took shape the way we're familiar with today. But in the period before that, when, as we know, as is well known, it was quite challenging to practice Yiddishkeit exactly the way one should and in a way that would last. The young generation that grew up here didn't take anything for granted. You couldn't expect them to accept just anything. And what maybe their Zaydus understood as a davar pashut was not pashut to the young American generation. And the older people sometimes were a bit despairing. They didn't feel like they could carry out, do things exactly the way they should be done. So as a result, very often what you ended up having was that there became like an American version of different aspects of Yiddishkeit, different details that ended up being different than the way things had been done before. This is not to say that everything that was done the way it was done in Europe was always amazing, or that everything that was done here in America, I'm not being mizalzel, a lot of people did try to keep Yiddishkeit to the best of their ability, but we're overgeneralizing. So one of the examples of this, which is probably long forgotten nowadays, and you'd really have to take a special interest in it to discover this, is that at some point, about 100 years ago in the United States, before, from like 1900 to 1940, 1950, the first half of the 1900s, there was a phenomenon throughout the United States that they made mikvahs exclusively using tap water, using water from the plumbing, from the pipes, no rainwater, no meimayin, none of that, just the tap water. And this was with the endorsement, with the hiraz, haskamas of the G'dolei HaRabbanim. There were some G'dolei HaRabbanim then in America, Chashvei Rabbanim, and it was their site, they agreed. I don't know, love Daphne. And this continued even a bit after you have the new yeshivas and the Haredische communities. You still had some holdovers, some mikvahs in the 50s that still operated that way, until with time they all got replaced and it's been entirely forgotten. So this is a very interesting subject from a halachic perspective, from a historical perspective, from the history of the halacha perspective. This also touches on the general question of how is halacha decided, assuming that the people who are matir in these cases hadn't just made a terrible mistake or deluded themselves, assuming that it was a legitimate psak. So when do we consider a heter like this? Like, oh, this is a heter with the agreement of the G'dolei HaPoskim. And when do we say, oh, this is a terrible pirza, you're being matter things according to shittas that are not fid halacha? And it comes to mikveh, if you just learn all the shittas in Rishonim, would we be able to guess on our own exactly what would be upkapaskan halacha l'maisa or not? It's not so simple and straightforward. So before we actually discuss that subject, which I want to discuss, I want to touch a bit on the meta halachic discussion, the overall discussion going on that touches on a lot of inyanim mikvahs, which is, are we looking to be machmir? Are we not? Who said what? In which case? So in generally speaking, on this question of how do we pass in mikvahs, there are two general quotations that represent the two sides of the discussion. So I assume everyone remembers the first shach in Seminary Shalaf, Shach says that the Be'eris, you have a well where there's a mayan that you dug the well, but there's a mayan within the well, so it's a mayan gomer l'chol davar, like the Marik said, like the Beis Yosef said. If you look in the Beis Yosef, so the Marik, he quotes the Marik in Siman and Vav, that the Marik said that Be'eris asim b'dei adam, that there's mayan nevea, even though the water isn't going anywhere else, that's a din mayan gomer. So if you look in the Marik itself, though, you'll see that the main background, what was the whole premise of the discussion in the Marik? So the background to the Shaila and Tshuva was about regarding Achshash of that whether Gimel Lugin, Mayim Shuvin, Pasel, Amayan. That was the discussion. And right in the beginning here, the Marik writes there that you have Paiskim that Taina, Paiskim that say that the Gimel Lugin, Mayim Shuvin, are Pasel even, a mikvah nevea, even when you have natural water in the mikvah. So, Pshita, don't think that this supports the svara, that there's a difference between a pure mayan and a be'er, also b'dei adam, and that's why they're being machmir by the mikvah nevea, because it's not really a mayan. No. If they hold that, it means they hold b'chlal, that by mayan, gimel, lugim, mayim, shovin, or pasla mayan also. There's no distinction. So that's where the two issues come together. So that was what the Marik was discussing. So what should they do practically if there's a shaila of a be'er, there was a well, and there's a shaila of mayim shovin, which, as he established, is identical to a mayan. So what do you do? So this is a din that comes up in Shulchan Aruch and Seif Mem, assuming you got up to there. So if you look in the Tur, in the Kata Shaykh to Seif Mem, so the Tur wrote that if you want to take the water out of the mikveh to clean the mikveh, and you're afraid that water is going to splash back out of the keli which you're using to draw the water, and Gimel Lug and Mayim Shuvin are going to fall into the mikveh once there's less than 40 sa'ah, and it's going to pass it. So the Torah said, make a hole in the bottom, and then even when you're drawing buckets out, whatever you're drawing out in the bucket is not actually considered Mayim Shuvin due to the hole. And then the Torah says, V'im ha-mikveh neveya, and if it's there's a spring, it's not, as we've been discussing. As ein tzarech lekach, ki hamayin eini nifsel b'shiva. So the Torah said straight out, the mayin is not nifsel b'shiva. If you look in the Beis Yosef there, Beis Yosef says, for kasafti le'el. Where's le'el? So that was in the Beis Yosef, in the Ge'er to the Ket of Sif Tazvav. Because if you look in Sif Tazvav, so the Mechaber says, mikveh that has a borim se'ah, or a mayin koshu, you can be shoyev whatever you want to put it in, even if it's more than the mayim shoyev b'tchila. And then you have the hagav, the Ramah there. Ve'ein chiluk min kodem hamayim l'shuv and Eloi. It doesn't matter what came first. And the Kamon Sif Mem, the Yesh Chalkin, he sends us back to this ahead to this Sif Mem, which is where the argument, where the discussion really happened. So back there in Sif Tazvav, when Mechaber said that it's not a problem. So the Beis Yosef quoted there and said, "Sheyesh mishinir medvarav," that there is a problem of shuvin and a mayan if there isn't memsa, and the Marik in that shuva essentially was being chayshish lechatchila to that shita. Kalmakim, the Marik wrote that if there's no option, there's no solution, whatever solutions there might be. So Marik said, I hold that if they had never actually closed the hole from which the well goes into from which the spring goes into the well, so it was connected to the source the entire time. So if it always had a shem mayan, then we're going to say, the Marik says, we're going to say that it was never nifsal from the shuvim, even though there are the paiskim that are machmir with shuvim and a mayan. But kedayim a paiskim amatirim lismach aleim kol shekem b'shas atchak. No, that may have been actually in Marik Siman. Hey, there's two Simanim there on this. The Meshesef quotes Sherish Nunvav, and he says that the Marik was Mayrech a lot about this, and at the end, the Marik said, Seif Dover, from all these reasons, I say, Devada, if you're able to clean the be'er, if and where you don't end up with 3 lugin mayim shovim, that's very good. But if there's any doichik, and this is going to start causing complications, it's going to cause a dichoy, a woman won't be able to be toivel, until it's going to delay the date, delay the tvila. So then ain't really a klal that she should be delayed from toveling. For it's just kind of a vaita chashash, all these sveikas in this kshash, to be mevatel b'nei Yisrael, period of Erivia, and the big quote is, v'chol amar b'chumenes b'isir d'Rabbanan, she'kelu b'chacham kol kach, k'dei levatel b'nei Yisrael, period of Erivia, eimer ani de'enoi elo min amasmihin. This is ridiculous. What are you saying? So that's the big quote from Marik on this matter, that if it ever comes down to delaying a tefillah, then you're off track. So the Beis Yosef here, this is in Beis Yosef of Sif Mem. So the Beis Yosef says, Lenias daiti, I think it's a chumri, even Marik goes too far. I think it's a chumri yesera to be choshesh shemayim shuv min hamayim, because the Poskim Hama for Samim said that it's not, and he says that's what the Mishnah seems to imply. So I feel the chatchila, and he wants to say that even it could be the Marik, after Shamarik Gam Huzay's Ima, it could be the Marik really also knows the truth that you shouldn't really be choshesh. But because there were people, the people that were coming to passel the mikvah over there, even b'diavad, so how far do you want to push back? So filu yahavin lahu kol tusayu. So he's sort of saying, according to the Beis Yosef, the Marik is saying, even if I agree with the mistake you're making, ain't the paisle b'diavad. But that really the Marik doesn't even think it's a problem. There was a quote to Masadash in there that after he said that ein mayim shuvim paislim, however the Masadash said the minig b'chol makaymis is to be makbid. The Poel and the Shulchan Aruch Sif Mem, the Mechaber wrote just like the Torah without any changes. Mayim noivim ein tzarich lekach ki hamayin einoi nifsel b'shiva. But then there's the Ramah, like we said in Sif Tazvav, the Ramah sent us to Sif Mem, and the Ramah says mikol makem nogel achmer gam b'mayin, because yesh cholken and says shiva pesalas, and therefore the chatchili should be machmer to make the hole in the keli even when you're being shoyev from a mayin, to make sure there's no problem. And if you didn't do that, and you were shoyev b'kli shalim, and it seems that 3 lugin fell into the mikveh, so if you're able to, and now you're just you keep on having this problem, and you want to clean it in a kosher way. So if you can close the holes, b'kalos teiv la'achmer. But if there's a teirach gadol b'davar b'diavel, you didn't do it. Yesh lismech hamakilin the severin the ein shiva pesalas b'mayin ki kein iker. So what you're seeing here is, first you have the Marik himself with the lashon that he wrote, that quotable quote. If you add too many chumras and you start causing problems, that's a bad thing. You have the Mechaber who agreed with him and took it even further, and then you have the Ramah who essentially brings the same position, the Marik exactly. You should be machmer, but the Yaved, Teirach Gadol, you should be Samech HaMakil, and that's the Iker. This Marik and this approach are also cited by the Beis Yosef Halacha L'Maisa. In one of his tshuvas, the Beis Yosef has Shaus tshuvas Avkas Reichel. So if you look there in Simon Samach Aleph, so the Beis Yosef writes there, the Mechaber, it says, Dvar HaMikveh, there's a mikveh in the Merchatz. And the person he's writing to also ma'arer on it, and he was telling them they can't toivel in it. And he was telling them instead to go in the Nahar. So Mechaber says, I have to tell you, my opinion, the mikveh in the Merchatz, we're going to explain a little bit in a second, is kosher b'li safek. Kol shekain, if you have nowhere else to toivel except in a Nahar, because pshita medbiyah b'kutcha, that this mikveh with whatever problem of shuvin we're about to discuss is a lot better than going to the Nahar. The Nahar is a much bigger problem. And he says, what do you want to pass in the mikveh? So he mentions that you're tining that because it's in the Merchatz, so the balonim, the bath attendants are washing the begadim. Maybe he means they're washing the towels, and they wash let's say they wash the towels in the water itself, and then they take the clothing out, and you have water dripping out of the clothing, and that's considered shovim, which is its own subject, that shovim begadim. And also another issue is that apparently the water was coming through a tziner, and they used kadim to fill up the water from the tziner, and when they were filling up that water, you also had water splashing out of the kelim into the mikveh. So the Beis Yosef says in the Shuvah, says Valzani Omer that it's not nifsos. First of all, he says she'ein b'mayim hanoit from beged shema'at from boy b'merchatz. So yeah, talking about a towel. The towels that I'm familiar with, the water that drips out of a towel, or the water that splashes out of the kad, it's not gimel lugin. That's not. You don't have a shear of solar. And if it's less than Gimel Lugin, it's not Paisel. Basics. And he says, because Gimel Lugin, everyone knows Lag Ba'emer, Chai Ratel, no one today probably remembers what a Ratel is, but Ratel is an Arabic measurement of liquid. It's the word liter, sort of transposed into Ratel. I think in the Rambam, there's different gersayos throughout the Rambam, if it's litra or Ratel, when he mentions this Shiur. Anyway, so he says, Gimel Lugin is a Chatzi Ratel, and Chazaka, that the baggage is out from by B'merchet, or the water that splashes out, it's not Chatzi Ratel. You know, you put it in the terms we're familiar with, it's not that amount. So you're going to tie in a fine, one towel or one kad, but there are multiple towels and multiple kadim. So what if they squeezed all three or splashed all three at the same time, and from three kadim together it's mitzaref? As long as it's ad sheyafsik chaverei, if that's all happening simultaneously. He says, we're also not chayshish, and he gives a whole mahok to explain why. Sfeikus and svek sveikus. Three lugin into where there's not memsa. That's
you're assuming that there's no memsa.
That would be the problem. So v'chol so he says v'chol that's b'chol if we're assuming let's shleisha lugim or possible b'chol on a mayan like in make shamim, because if you say that it's, as we've been discussing, if you say that it's not the place of a mayan, so then even with all these reasons it's not a problem. So he gets back into this, that he was also the case he was making in the Beis Yosef itself, and all the Paiskim and Shonim Achreidim all are asking to be machshir, like the Ma'arik himself says, and the Ma'arik and the end of his Shuvah said that if there's any daichik, it's going to cause a tichui. So it's not right to delay for chash shirachik like this with all these sveikas. He quotes the same quote in his Shuvah and Afkas Reichel. And it was a mayan in a merchatz. That's what we said in the beginning. It was a mayan in a merchatz, and the assumption is that it may have happened when the mikvah was chaser. So that's what he's saying. That in this case, even if vaday naflu teich gimel look at mayim shuv and kishahaya mikvah chaser lenifsa bekach given the mayan. So I don't even have to care about all the other issues. It's a mayan. And there's more to the tshuva there, but he gets into why this is definitely better than a nahar. So here you see that this is the Mechaber is going with this shita, not just in Beis Yosef Shulchan Aruch, but even in a Ma'aseh Shahaya Allah L'Ma'aseh. Now another place where I saw this Ma'arik quoted is actually in a very interesting shuvah by Rabbi Eisel Homler, which is printed in Chana Ariel, which is mostly Chassidus, but there's also other Yonim there from Rabbi Eisel. It's also reproduced in the Sefer Toldos Yitzchak Isaac that has material on him. And they added Semar Mekaymis. However, from going through it, I see there are a number of militzas and ramazim which were not sufficiently, adequately explained in the Mar Mekaymis. But anyway, what Rabbi Eisel is doing there is Rabbi Eisel is arguing with an unnamed Rav who apparently had taken issue with the Alter Rebbe's Tikkun HaMikvah. And this Shuvah Rabbi Eisel, I found it's Bar 11 seems to quote it. The one place that I could find in the Sefer Tikkun mikvahs, actually in Taras Mayim, Talishkin brings it in a few places, but otherwise doesn't seem to be quoted that commonly. It's not so familiar. So there's a lot of interesting Nakudas in there. So I'm going to take the time to go through some of the Nakudas, including the final one, which relates to what we're discussing. So Rabbi Eisel begins in that Shuvah. Very sharp. There's a sharp tone throughout the tshuva. He's standing up for the cover of the Alter Rebbe. He calls the Alter Rebbe the Lashon Rabban Shel Kol Bnei Hagayla. So he says this person wrote a couple of pages. He calls it Ma'ate Ha'echos Rabbi Hakamos. Big in quantity, not so much in quality. Against the Alter Rebbe's Tikkun mikvahs. So before he even starts quoting Tainus, he immediately launches into this shtikla. Today, we're all considered chaylim when it comes to cold. To just explain the basic justification for why we're trying to put together this system of heating the mikvah. So we're all considered chaylim. And that's besides the chash that Yitaka won't be toivel properly. And he mentions a concept in halacha that Ta'irisha has namanas for things that are going to get to her, but when does she have namanas? Only when there's no tircha, Once there's tercha, then you have and psachim, atzlanias, which is its own subject, its own discussion. And the minig, he mentions the minig to heat the mikveh already spread before the Alter Rebbe, even though in the early Makaitis, in the Rishonim, it says pretty clearly, even in Shulchan Aruch, it says pretty clearly not to toivel in hot water. I'm going to mention it again later on, and that's perhaps a shiur in its own right for a different occasion, the history of hot water in a mikveh. So he says rich people maybe can pour hot water whenever they need, but poor people don't have that kind of quantity of hot water. So therefore the Alter Rebbe, due to all this, therefore the Alter Rebbe had to make this takana, and it's takana kavua for rich and poor alike, that the system to prevent the mikveh from getting too cold too fast the way it was until then. And he says, especially according to the Alter Rebbe, if you're making a hole, the hole has to be bereich of tefach, right? It says in Tikkun HaMikveh, tefach al tefach merubah, shu yoser ma'at mimaytzirimayin. For those who remember that whole discussion. So if you have a normal box with a hole on the sides, the water is gonna freeze very fast. And the Reisel mentions mashahaya minig mikadem. There was an existing minig lasses kamin barza to make it like a faucet. Belistim hanekev be'es hatalas acham on the mikveh, and to close the hole when you put the hot water. Pasche be'es hatvila, and then to open the hole when it's time to toivel. So that way you're hoping that at least for the moment of tvila, it is hot, even though the hole is big. So he says, Karev be'enai, I assume the way nichalei zal b'hachi, that Alter Rebbe did not like that. It's very easy for things to go south, to go wrong, because what if you're going to forget to open it? If it's mamash tali and opening by every tvila, what if you forget to open it by a tvila? And I already have experienced this with people using the old takana. So I had a case where this happened. Something similar happened in Krem and Shug. So, not a good idea. So that you can have the hole with a faucet and close it and open it, it's too risky. So that's why the Alter Rebbe came up with the whole system, with the holes on the bottom, and then you put it down, and the hole isn't really allowing water in. And then comes a very interesting shtickle here in the Reisel. According to this, where the mikveh is not actually directly open and connected to the bur, b'shas hatvila, so it's just water that's mechunas, and you can't consider it a din of meimayin. Emekach klum, who cares? A zava, which is the din here, is not. She doesn't need mayim chayim. But karev leimer, and here's a very unusual statement: the karev leimer shamadaktik shetiya hatvila dafka b'mayim chayim over abal taisif. So there's a whole discussion about should be. He goes all the way to the extreme and says that if you're makvan amayim chayim, it's bal taisif, and you're looks like you have something wrong with what the chacham say. And I've seen some svarim nowadays that quote it as like a chiddush. This is what he said, and clearly this is. As also comes up later in the Shuvah, clearly, even though he didn't, spell out exactly what the person was tining, but apparently that seems to be part of the taina, that according to Alter Rebbe, it's sort of its own thing.
Do you see anywhere else where people are not on mayim chayim?
So he says, "V'aloi rakbim dinosenu shemayonus mitzuyim roi mikvahs hene mayonas." It happens to be that in Russia, where there is a lot of wells, it was very common to dig wells and to hit the springs. It happened to be very common that there were a lot of mayonas. But it's not bedafka. B'sharim yedinas v'chol tfutas Yisrael mentioning Gemara Paiskim. It's mei ma'ara. So mei ma'ara is not it's pulled up in a ma'ara. That's why it would go bad, as we know from Chazal. So there's no diuk in mayonas at all. And then he says anyway, even the mikvahs that we have in our Medina, the way it's built, the mayan isn't coming from the ground; it's coming from the doifen. And he explains that means that it's not actually a din mayan. So no one cares about din mayan, so the Alter Rebbe's tikkun isn't changing anything. And now he starts going through specific tainas that this unnamed Rav mentioned. So one of the tainas this Rav seemed to raise was that what about the nemanos, right? You have in Sif Dalet, in the Ramah, the mikvahs shahisa chaseda lefanenu, and then you found it full. So one of the things it says there is that the Vada Yisrael Mila Isa Yid filled it. So then Ksheira, the Reva Matzur Neitzel Mikveh are Bekian. So Avada was Behachsher. Kol Sheken if Yisrael's Lefanenu, and he tells us that he filled it Behachsher, that he's Namon Behachsher B'Yodei L'Takna, because it's something that he could have done. So if it's something he could do, so we might as well believe him that he did it. Kai Gavna Erachanam B'Yisunim, that was all in Se'ev Dalet. So it seems like this Rav was being aware that in the Alter Rebbe sticking a mikveh, maybe we shouldn't be so trusting in this scenario. So he quotes a little bit of this Rav. As far as I know, whatever this Rav wrote has not appeared in any other source. We only have whatever Rabbi was quoting from him. So he quotes the Rebbe saying, "Mikol makom tzarech sheyeh b'yodei l'takna." The Rama says, "B'yodei l'takna." It's something he's able to do. So we have to make sure that it's b'yodei l'takna. And he threw in, this Rav threw in the whole hechad is chazak yisura, that when you have a chazaka, that the mikveh is not kosher, so the standard to establish the mikveh is kosher is high. And that Rav wrote, "V'ke'es le'yadati be'ez oifen yiyah b'yad ha'ed tamid l'takin mikveh chaser t'jismal b'hachsher." I'm not so sure why is it always b'yad l'takna. Every aid that tells you that mikveh is kosher, he was able to make sure the mikveh was kosher himself. So mashma, that what this Rav was trying to say was that the way this mikveh is designed, it's totally in individuals. Mashenkin, maybe the way normal mikvahs were set up, there was more of an achrei, not fully clear, but he seemed to be higher on the nemanas issue in this case. So Rabbi Ezel said, if you're talking about this mikveh, how is it biyadai? So it's simple. If you had no choice, just smash a hole in the box, and then it will connect to the burr, and then it will certainly be kosher that way. It's not that hard to fix it in that way. And anyway, when you have a mikveh chasera, that's not called this chazak yisura, which is its own topic for itself. In this case, the mikveh on its own fills up. You put the box in, and then it slowly fills up. So certainly it shouldn't be considered that how is this mikveh? Certainly say it's chazak yisura. Nataya, then shchita. We do have higher standards. We don't just trust anybody. So he said, Mish yesh le'inayim liris. If you're looking, you understand. Yesh le'kadav zel zeh klal. There's no comparison. There, we're concerned about the level of bekios. Ramah said that people that are matzim mikvahs are bekiim. So when it comes to shchita, also you want to make sure that the people attack a bekiim. It's very easy to not be sufficiently baki. So that's why based on is being chayker v'dayresh to make sure that the shaykhtim are bekiim. But when it comes to nemanos, if he knows the Isser V'Heter, and we just want to know whether we should trust him, how is Beistin's investigations going to help, he says. You can always do whatever he wants if you're being chayshish to that. And we never heard that Beistin is muzer to check the reyes after the Baidik is Baidik the reyes, and to second guess, to double check if he's doing a good job. We never heard that they checked the knives of the sheikhet after he shechted. It says, V'zeh pashat ma'od. I shouldn't even be writing this, but just in case someone got the wrong impression from what this guy wrote. So shalai yachshav sheyesh ben mamash. It would be interesting to see how that lines up with the approach of Akshedim today, and maybe that's for a different occasion. He writes more in this vein. Then he points out that actually there's interesting diuk in say the Tikkun HaMikvah Alter Rebbe, because at the end it mentions a Shomer Nemon. When it came to making sure that it fills up properly, it said Tzarav L'Hishiv Sham take of Shomer Nemon to make sure that no She'uvim falls in until the box fills up. But earlier it didn't say Shomer Nemon. Earlier it said to warn the Balon. Right? When it said that the Goiva Hamayim should be 7 Tvachim and they should make a mark on the box and warn the Balon who's in charge that he should never pour hot water into the box until he sees that the Mayim Akshedim are up to that line. There he doesn't mention the Shomer Nemon. So Muzman Zag like this, that B'tchilas Tikkun HaMikvah B'sgerecht, Ein B'yodai L'takein Kol Kach B'kal. It's not so, saying Nemonos B'yodai L'takna, it's not so easy B'yodai L'takna in the beginning. So therefore, the Alter Rebbe Taka said, you do need a mumcha, you do need an expert, someone who's a Shomer Nemon. So that's how it works. Masha'enke, once the mikveh was fixed, and now the balon is just pouring hot water in, and that's all he has to do. All you have to do is warn him about the line, and if there's a line, if it's below the line, not to pour anything at all. And he'll also be very careful once you tell him how this works. He'll be very careful, and he won't pour unless there's this simon. And for him, that's biyadei l'takna. It's very easy for him to just stick to that rule. What else does he have to do? And he doesn't lose anything out by sticking to that rule. So of course he's neman. There's no chshad over here. And anyway, Meisel still upset about this chazak yisur. Calling it his chazak yisur. Once they fix the mikvah properly once, now it says chazak katera. As far as you know, the mikvah is good. So the Baalin is also neman to tell you that he's keeping it right. Another thing the Rav had commented on was that the Alter Rebbe said that when the woman goes in, she has to hold on to the bottom part of the ladder of the steps, so that her hair doesn't go above the water. So the Rav wanted to tie that this is an issue of nemanus, of trusting the woman that she did it exactly like this. So now Rabbi Ezel gets the most upset. He says, he seems to say he himself doesn't know who he's arguing with. He says, so I don't even know who I'm arguing with over here, so I don't even know what to say. He says, because what he just said now is not even a right for the guy who wrote all these hasagas until now that I didn't think too highly of. Even though all the tiniest until now were nothing, but at least it was respectable. It was It's a pasuk v'ayna and the Gemara Darshans b'chachamim ayna b'talmidim that being ma'ir or something. At least you're being ma'ir vart. But what you said here about the manus of the woman, I feel katan sheb'talmidim lo yita behen. No, the child wouldn't make this mistake, or at least a very junior talmid wouldn't make this mistake. That we shouldn't give the manus to a woman when it comes to their own tevila. The whole Taisvis, the whole thing with chametz is that tirchi yisera, you need a dikta godel. But to tell her that she should put her head on the bottom rung of the ladder, that's not tirchi yisera. And that goes for everything relating to mikvah. It's not tirchi yisera. I don't understand. Do we want to aid them to stand there by every tefillah? Every woman who goes to the mikvah, we should have two people standing there to see echt t'panu b'nes Yisrael, and then to go to the husband and give b'teiras edus that we saw that she tabled the right way. We never heard of such a thing. We never heard of anyone being mefakbek. And why all of a sudden are you waking up regarding this chash of the hair floating in this design compared to every other zehirus and the whole tefillah itself? He says, "Be'emes eini yedei klal mahaya b'daitish shal kaisef," and I don't know what he was thinking. To be mechalek between this and that. So he discusses a few other things there, but we're gonna move on now to the final inyan, which is negaya to what we've been discussing here, which is cleaning the box. So when you clean the box, vaitus, you have a chash, you have a shayla of shuvim, you're being shy of the water. So if mem and Shulchan Aruch. So in Shulchan Aruch it said you make a hole. Now it seems like this Rav wanted to be mefakbek that maybe only in a mayan it would work to make a hole, but or a small hole. But if it's not a mayan, as we established, it's a water in a box. So then he's being chayshish. So Reisel said from the Ramah it seems that it's we're being chayshish for both, and this is the solution for both. And anyway, he said that b'poil Rav mikvahs don't have it in mind, as he already established in the beginning. It's not like Kastam mikvah is a mayan. Either because it's near a nahar, which is that whole discussion, and the Eisel mentions v'hamoifis l'zeh is shamayim shemikvah shavim b'goy v'atamid l'fi hanar l'mei hanar. You always see that the water in the hole is exactly at the same level as the water in the nearby nahar, so that's how you know it's not really a mayan. And even if it is a mayan, as he said, if it's not, the hole isn't on the bottom, if the hole's on the side, it's not really a mayan. So this is the mikvah. This is all the mikvahs. There's no difference between any other mikvah and what the Alter Rebbe is doing here. So then why are you picking on the Alter Rebbe? He says, we don't even have to get into that because of all mikvahs, the Alter Rebbe's system is the best because you literally have a very nice, professionally crafted, smooth box. So you can actually clean it very well until there's not even gimelugin left in the box. You can mamish dry it out. Use kelim ktanim and a sfoig, and it's a smooth box. And anyway, we explained that the minig of using the kelim with a hole, even the size of a adasha, yes, you can even use that in this mikveh. Wouldn't be a problem. And this is where he brings the ma'arikim. Any element amasmiyim, like the ma'arik said at the end of the tshuva. He quotes that if it's going to cause any dichoy, and he's talking about ma'im shovim. This is the topic. in the element of Masmim, so, and he says, anyway, it's ironic, this matter has all these chashas, Benegeas, Safik, Mayim, Shuvim, which is where the Marik says what he says. And the chashas that I mentioned in the beginning, about if you actually had just a cold mikveh, the chash that you won't tackle properly, that's chashas gemuris, umidina, ubirsa deraisa. So, pick your battles. Why do you care about that more than this? Good, bad, good. You have it all backwards. He signs Yitzhak Isaac Epstein from Hummel. So anyway, so we see that's one side of the discussion of the Marik's statement about in the element of Masmin and what's the other Rabbi Shraga.
The bottom line is the chashash that people look at and so on is all over Shach. And basically, the chashash not taken properly is the way to develop the Shach. Why give more weight to that?
Well, ultimately, that's everything else. There's many shittas, but if you're not fully in the water, that's just even if Chazal don't have to mention it, that's just that's some tefillah. If you didn't table properly, you didn't table. So why were the Rishonim not concerned when they get cold water? Apparently, they didn't see any problem. That's the taina that in later generations we're not handling the cold water the same way. But like I said, maybe we'll have a discussion about that whole history about the hot water and the cold water. So that's on one side. Then on the other side, you have the famous, it's pretty famous because it's quoted a lot, the Tashbates and his Chuvas. I'll give a little background there. The question was about a mikveh that was pretty small. It was on the small side. And the walls were not straight and proper, and there's water seeping out through the cracks, which means, and because the mikveh is so small, so that means that the shiur is always at risk of being depleted. So they're always being meisav mayim through amshacha. And one of the questions was simply like, how do we measure this? So that was one thing he discussed. Then he says, that the walls are ruined and there's water seeping through the cracks, and you always have to add water through amshacha. So that's fine. And even without amshacha, it's fine, because as long as there's memsa, as long as we can verify that there's always memsa that hasn't seeped out, and the schila problem isn't the problem here, which he discusses. But mikol makom, even though it's kosher, ideally you should make it a little deeper in the ground or make the walls higher. It's always better to have more of the shiur. Kol shekei, that you're telling me that the walls are not built properly, and every day the water is getting less, and you could be chayshish that will get so low that the woman, Pashat, here's the chash of just the tevilah itself. She won't be able to be bend over in the proper way. It'll end up being a chatzitza. So, and you should also, he says, Pashat practice, you should take some sid, cover the walls so it should become waterproof, and don't rely on beiras nishbarim asher lo yechilu hamayim, like the pasuk says. Whether you're using hamshach or not, that's not the issue here, because it has memsa, but you should fix your mikveh. Don't have such a dilapidated mikveh. Then he says, yesh lachosh for the raivid. The raivid of, if you have less than shir mikveh, and then, meaning if you, because you're constantly, you tell me this mikveh is constantly losing water, and you're constantly putting in mayim shuvim. So according to the raivid, if nasan sava natal sa, so ultimately, over time, that's what's going to happen here. According to the Shittas Raivid, you're literally the original water is dissipating, and it's slowly being replaced until you get to Raiv. Until Raiv in the mikveh is going to be this mayim shuvim that you keep on pouring in to be mashlim. So even though the achreinim are maskim, and even Mekai Gavin, it's kosher because you're doing zriya, and Nas and someone else is talking about mepedes and mayim shuvim, kol yoyim any paisel. So whatever you're putting in is bottled to the mikveh. Mikol makom, this is the key quote from the Tashbitz that became like the quote. Makom she'av shel ataken v'lot sidei kol asveikes ein roi lahachnes reishenu b'machlekasen. If you can do it and make everyone happy, why get involved in a machlekes? Of course, that whole discussion, nothing so not is its own major topic. We'll get back to it a little bit soon. So this became mamish like a quote, like a sisma, slogan for many poskim. You see this especially in the Sefer Chibur Latara by the Hardensteipler, where he mentions it right in the Akdama. He says that this is what the Tashbitz says, and he says, "Ba'avur zeh, it's for this very reason, this Tashbitz that inspired me to malakit all the days, even the ones that are not quoted in Shulchan Aruch Halacha, because that way we'll be able to know how to make the mikvah to be yetza, even the opinions of the machmirim, even if the halacha is not paskin like them in Shulchan Aruch. If you look in the New Chibur Latara and the Haaretz there, they're mitzayin to more makayres. Another source that is malakit makayres on this is actually a kuntris called Kovetz Taras HaMikvah. Came out in the last few years. Doesn't have a name or details of printed. It's like an anonymous kuntris. And it's written sort of for persuasion reasons. It's meant to persuade whoever's reading it that Bar Gabi Bar is the best. So in Perek Aleph of this kuntris, you can find it in Eitzar Chachma. So in Perek Aleph, he has an overview, Bekitzer.
Not the recording, we don't know who wrote it.
No, there really is no information. It could be someone knows. I didn't have a chance to ask around if it's known, but
Probably Bob.
well, if it's for Bar Gabi Bar, sure. So in chapter 1, he has a short overview of the history of mikvahs and how they were made, and then in chapter 2 is this topic, the chayva, the obligation to build a mikvah kshera, l'chol hadayis, and takes this point to the extreme, and he quotes just endless svarim that all have these lines, these quotes in the course of the Shaklavataria, that you want to be yetzi kol hadayis, such as the Tashbitz. He's like 21 k'tayim over there like this, from across the spectrum. And then the next chapter talks about what would be the problem with the way Zriya is done today, and what would be the problem with the way Hashak is done today, and then, what's the solution? Bar Gabi Bar. Mamish, though, to just quote the Tashbitz, to just quote all of those Makayres, it's not giving you the full picture. We see there are Makayres mitzad sheni, as we pointed out. There also are a lot of Makayres that don't necessarily touch. They don't have a quote in there that touches on the general question, like how do we look at mikvahs? But the Poel Mamish, either they're machmir or they're mekel, according to whatever the issue is at hand. I saw that they're mitzayin, that you find the Chassam Sefer and the Divrei Chaim of Tzanz are on opposite sides of the coin. They take opposite sides on two different issues. In one case, you have the Chassam Sefer, was chayshish for the shita of the Mordechai, Benegea using wooden pipes. Because the Mordechai is chayshish, maybe there's a guma in the pipe. Divrei Chaim responds very sharply. Lo yadati mi chosh l'chumra zu. I have no idea who's chayshish for this chumra. Shlehuva das hamachmir b'shulchan aruch. It's not in Shulchan Aruch. The Anchronim that I'm aware of. If we're being chayshish l'das yechidi, why are we toveling in hot water b'chlal? It says in Ramah and Shulchan Aruch not to tovel in hot water. Maybe be chayshish to that. And we know Bismana Kadmoinim, they talk about mak, but not to. What's with all Tidish Taitis Imecha? And they already were Makabal, the Shita that says it's Aser. Afu became all the G'dolim and all the Tzadikim, they're all were mater. So if that's how we react in that case, so Mikol Shekain to be Chayshish here for Das Yechidi, that was Nidcha from all the Achreinim. For the Isi Bekihilas K'daishas, already saw that the Chash Bekihilas, established Kehilas, use wood for the mikveh. However, actually, in that Shuvah, the Divrei Chaim does continue and say, but in Bonu Letakein, he does give us a suggestion. And again, hot water, that's a topic for another time. So there you have the Chassam Sefer being chayshish for the Das Yachid, and Divrei Chaim saying that's such a obscure Das Yachid, why would you be chayshish for that? Meidach Gisa, you have a big parsha with the Chassam Sefer. The Chassam Sefer was matir mikvah with two beiros using Zriya or Hashaka, and I believe I saw somewhere that they say that this Chassam Sefer with these beiros, that's pretty much the beginning of the history, meaning until then mikvahs were just done as holes in the ground, and Chassam Sefer being matir this system, that's sort of the beginning of the new era of mikvahs in Europe. So the Chassam Sefer wrote, this is what you do, you have two beiros, you fill one ber with 40 saw mayim kshin. Then your mamshech, you bring shuvim into pamshacha, and it's connected to the second bar. So you pour it into the first bar, and then it spills over into the second bar until both bars are full. And he says from now on, simple, you empty whichever bar you want, and then you can pour shuvim directly into the second bar, and it will keep on refilling. Whichever one, empty, refill, empty, refill. And he said there's no pick book. He made it sound like it's mamash, like lechatchila. So that turned into a huge discussion of those who came after him. What's with the Ram and Ravid, Nas and Soben Atalsa? The Divrei Chaim is considered, so in this case, the Chassam Sefer is saying it's no problem. And the Divrei Chaim is considered the one leading the Machmirim. Now, if you look in the Svarim of the Helmetzer, who's a name that comes up a lot when it comes to mikvahs nowadays, Reb Chananya Yom Tov Lipa-Deitch, he was a Hungarian Rav. We'll see, he's a big factor in mikvahs. So he has a lot of Svarim, mikvahs and other stuff. So in one of his Svarim, there's a letter from the Rav known as the Weizsäcker Ruv. The Weizsäcker Ruv is a Tzvi Hirsch Meislish. He was from Weizen, and then he ended up in Chicago, for those who may be familiar with the history of Chicago. So the Weizsäcker Ruv wrote like this. This is what the Weizsäcker Ruv wrote to the Helmetzer. It says, what you printed in your Sefer Chelik Aleph, you printed a letter from your Rav, the Rav, the Rebbe of the Helmetzer, was the Kashoyer, Shal Brach of Kashoy. So he printed a short letter there, that the Shal Brach writes that he told the Shinover is Becheskel Halberstam, the son of the Divrei Chaim, also is considered a Chashav Rav and Rebbe. He told the Shinover that in his Kehillah, Kashoy, or wherever he was at the time, which was in the region of the Chassam Sefer, which we really should respect the Psakim of the Chassam Sefer, he made a mikvah shlishis. He didn't want to rely on the Chassam Sefer and have two mikvahs, then you have Nasa and someone else. He made a third mikvah, 3 bayros. And so the first reaction of the Shinover was, he didn't like it. Because in Russisch Poland, that relates to the whole history of Russia and Poland, but he calls it Russisch Poland, you have mikvahs like this from the Chassam Sefer, and big tzaddikim were born from these mikvahs. So you're starting up with the Chassam Sefer, you're starting up with all these communities and all the tzaddikim that are born from the Chassam Sefer's mikvahs. So Shal Brach was taken aback. Then the Shinover told him, no, every tzaddik has a mother b'fnei atzmai, and the Rambam has a yeshiva l'mayla, and he doesn't accept as a Talmud, you don't get admitted to the Rambam's yeshiva in the yeshiva sh'mayla if you're born from a mikveh that had not al-sov and doesn't so. Yeah? So that's what the Shal Brach wrote in that letter to his Talmud the Helmetzer in the 30s. So the Weizsäcker writes that my relative, Asher Steinmetz of Bereksas, who wrote a sefer mikvahs called Mikvah Yisrael, so he also has the same thing, has a variation of this. It has happened with him also, that he also made a mikvah shlishis, and he also wasn't sure if it was the right thing to be machmir with some sefer, and he spoke to the Shinover, and the Shinover said, I don't know why, in Russia you have all the Gedolim and Kedoshim, hey nemes, that the Rambam doesn't allow someone into his yeshiva if you're born from this mikvah. So this is my relative, the Bereksas, he says it seems like that he really meant the last thing. From the Kasher, it sounds like the main reaction of Shinover was the first thing of why you're talking being machmir. The Bereksas says it seemed to him that the main thing was the sefer. The first thing he said was because you come to the Shinover and say I'm being choishish against the Chassam Sefer, so you have to say something to stand up for the Chassam Sefer. But Mila Yirtza. So ultimately, that's surely the more compelling statement of the Shinover. So why is the Weizsäcker bringing this up in this letter? He says that you, the Helmetzer, remind me that in Taras Hamayim, for some reason a lot of these, they call it Taras Hamayim. We're talking about Taras Hamayim of Telushka. And he's mitzayin to Daf Reish Zayin. That was in the previous edition. In the editions we have, you can look it up. It's on page Reish Samach. That Rav Telushkin attacks this quote b'shem the Shinover in a halada there, and very sharply Rav Telushkin says that it's dvarim she'enim kadoim le'omer. How could you say such a thing? I believe that the Divrei Cheskel, the Shinover, never said any such thing. And someone probably heard zakar avara, rumors v'talo b'ilan gadol, and now the Helmetzer is all offended because Telushkin is dismissing this quote. Meanwhile, the Helmetzer's Rav, the Kashoy wrote that happened with him. So chutzpah. He says, my Rebbe, you understand, your Rebbe was Marbitz Torah, your Shemayim, to thousands of Talmidim, and how can Telushkin react like that to what he said? So he says, Zeh bara that the Taras Mayim loy hikir, v'ulei loy shoma klal, my Rabbi Hagoyin and all. I think Taras Mayim certainly didn't know your Rebbe of Kashoy. You probably never even heard of him. So that's why he reacted the way he did. He doesn't know who he's dealing with over here. And I can use the same language against him. What he wrote is not Kedai Le'Omer. You say, Shara Le'Mare, Hashem should forgive him for saying what he said. Because you can't start up with the Pshul Barach like that. And the Ikar HaMaimer, I have other Shmuos and other gersayos of this Shmuah. He says, I heard from my mikvahs that actually happened with the Tzanter himself. Divrei Chaim was in Krakow, and he met Reb Shimon Sefer, who was the Av based in Krakow. Shimon Sefer was one of the sons of the Chassam Sefer, and he ended up in Krakow. And they were talking about this issue of V'natas Ovanatasa. And the Divrei Chaim said straight to Shimon Sefer's face that the Rambam is not going to allow anyone in his heichal if he's born from this mikvah. And Shimon Sefer said, well, let me tell you something. I was born from my father, Chassam Sefer's mikvah, so just thought you should know that. That's the version that he cites. He says, okay, I heard another version of it that he says from different Makaitis, different Hungarian, the Deja, the Shinsky, that he was in Shinova, the Shinova showed him that he got a letter which directly from Shimon Sefer. Shimon Sefer wrote to Rabbi Cheskel, I heard that you're fighting against the mikvah of Meik Shamim. You should know that I was born from my father's mikvah. So he wrote it in a letter directly to the Rabbi Cheskel, that someone was there when the letter was there. That's the whole bitter that the Weizner makes. And he says, the Taras Mayim Tainas there in the Sefer, that Ayatachin, that Rambam is going to be makbid, and people that disagree with him. Ebazoi, the Ravid disagrees with the Rambam on a whole host of things. So that means that the Ravid can't be nichnas b'mechitzas Rambam, b'mayla. And what about all the Rishonim? And he doesn't quote it, but what about all these Rishonim that are matir, not to someone else and so? What about Esvahev B'sufa? That don't we all agree in the end? Aren't we all happy ever after? So Weizner Rav says, in my opinion, it's not a kasher. You see in Yavamis, the Mishnah says that B'Shamim Yisrael they had a machlekes over Arayas, and they still made shidduchim. It was beautiful. And the Gemara says, what about when it's actually Negeya, when they have the actual issue of Mamzeres? In that case, they would tell them, this person was born from this Inyan, and then this hill would be Peidish. So what do you see? The friendship is friendship, up till a certain point. But then when it comes to this, if someone's going to be born, if I hold that someone who's born from this is puzzle, I'm not making a shidduch with this person. So, Bazai, same would go if according to the Rambam you're born from a pasal mikveh, come in zagen, not a problem to say based on Gemara that he won't let you into his yeshiva. But then he wants to tie in a bichlal that the whole back and forth was never even about the Chassam Sefer's mikveh. That all the statements about not going into the Rambam, that's if you mamash are not choishish at all for not to someone else and so. But the Chassam Sefer tying it bets and know what he was doing. There was a solution to not to someone else and so. So Mamela, I don't believe that they were saying that about Chassam Sefer. That would be pretty upsetting to say. So that's what the Weizner of Tainas over there. He goes on at more barichas over there. And we find, so back to the point we're making though, that that was just the point there was just to say that the Chassam Sefer being Mekel here and the Divrei Chaim being Machmer and vice versa. So it doesn't, you have these statements, you have these very general sounding statements that we try to be Yetze Kol Hadayas, but then when it comes down practice, you find that each Pesach has his cases where Lavdafki is being Machmer at himself. We find this by the Rabbeim also, that it depends on the issue. Sometimes, if it's B'diavad Mamash, like the idea of Marek, that, B'diavad, you shouldn't necessarily delay going to mikvahs. We found with Rabbi Shraga, we saw that when it came to toveling in the Nohar, the Rav wrote to Rabbi Shraga that he's being matir, needless to Reis, that Rabbi Shraga said, not so fast. We also had Shuvas of the Tzemach Tzedek that we've learned here, where the Tzemach Tzedek says, okay, B'diavad, do this, do that. So you have mamash b'diavad. You have cases where it's sort of like an ongoing b'diavad, like it was mentioned here at one point that it's not like they were rushing to build mikvahs, bar gabe bur, wherever Anash were, not even over here. It took decades till they built one over here. So you're writing a chapter saying that you have to machna kol hadayas, or else the children look right here. Clearly, it's not been taken to that extent ourselves. And even the Chatchil, if you look, you'll see, if you go through every single thing Rabbeim said about mikvahs, you'll find that there are shittas that Lamaisa we're not following. It's not called shitta sheba'elam mamish. In conclusion of this discussion, I just want to point out another interesting discussion related to this. There's someone today, his name is Rabbi Yaakov Chaim Sofer. He's the Einakol of Rabbi Yaakov Chaim Sofer from Iraq, who is the Kaf HaChaim, so he has the same name. So he has a lot of interesting discussions in his Svarim, I believe my impression is that he has a bit of an independent streak from Rabbi Yosef, and I believe I've seen the Sfarim of Rabbi Yosef's children that they sometimes push back and attack Yaakov Chaim Sefer for different things. Anyway, in the Sefer Shalem Yaakov, which is one of his many Sfarim, he has a chapter about Sfardim. Of course, one of the big issues is always from Kabul, Hayrois of Moran of the Mechaber Beis Yosef, right? So the question is, what about in Inyani Even HaEzer? So he has a whole chapter, and it starts there. The whole discussion springs from a big klal written by Rabbi Yomtiv El-Ghazi, who we actually got to know in the last year about a totally different issue. So Rabbi Yomtiv El-Ghazi has Shal Shuvah Simchas Yomtiv. So I'll quote the Shaila there because it's a little interesting. He says, there's a woman that toiveled Beis Adar Beis Tov Kuf Mem Vav, 1786. And the women who apparently, you had a lot of families and people just living and sleeping all together. So the women who sleep with her in the same house, Heidu al Yehudasam, they swore by their Jewishness. That's, to emphasize that what they're saying is true, that 2 nights after her Leil Tvila, which apparently was everyone's business, that husband was peirush from her, b'pnei pachad hamagefa. Was Magefa going on, and he split from her. It's a new one, right? Instead of sticking with the family, he split from the family, and he didn't come back to sleep at all. And this woman, she continued sleeping among all the women who were sleeping together. And then a few days later, Yodalit of Adar Beis, the woman left the house, and she was quarantined in a chutzner with the women, and the husband was quarantined in another chutzner with the men who made a hesger, the Shmirim and Hamagefa, and through this Hasger, like Karav Zel Zeh, so they certainly had no chance of being together after that. And then the husband died, and they didn't have any children. And he has one brother who's 6 or 7, one of those situations. And this woman, though, she was pregnant, and about 8 months later, Vav Cheshvan Tov Kufem Zayin, she gave birth. And everyone who was there, because right there, everyone's hanging around, so they all looked at the child and they said, Yatsa Chai V'Shalem, it was complete. It's not like it was, looked like it was premature. But after 8 days, the child passed away. So that's one of these, like I said, one of these classic situations with Chalitza. And there's one aide who says, Be'edis Gemara, that the Baal told him actually a month before, then Adar Aleph, he told him my wife is pregnant. So now the question is, does she need chalitza? Does she have to wait till this child grows up or not? That was the question. Now, the main discussion there is if it's counts from Adar Beis, he was not born in Tes Chadashim, it's 8 Chadashim, and he didn't live 30 days. If you had one or the other, you'd be in a better situation, but here you have neither. Now, part of the discussion touches on the fact that Abaya has this word of piek umes, that if you see that a child sort of dies like this, like he yawns and dies, there's nothing else to it, that is a sort of a siman, sort of a proof the child was a nefel. He died so easily. And then you have smakaitis that are marchiv. It's not only piek umes, even chala umes. Even if he seemed okay and then he fell ill, if it's within 30 days, it's also considered a siman that it's a nefel, even though there's no other siman. However, they're different. The Rambam don't mention the whole piek umes, that whole thing. So that's mashma, that the different Rambam don't hold like a bayah. So on this, Rabbi Yomtiv El-Ghazi writes, "V'af l'marim b'shulchan aruch, or af d'marim b'shulchan aruch pasuk harif v'Rambam the lay kaim along kabayas." Even though modern seems to be going in this mahalach, so we should be makel because the child was born healthy and there's no piek umes, so we don't hold of piek umes chol umes. But mikomakim kvar yedua the lenient iser erva. The Gittin, the Kiddushin, the Yibum, the Chalitza. Actually, Anunaigim Lispa is Kala Chumre Shal Kala Paiskim. We actually don't, we're not beholden to Maran, to the Mechaber Lakula. We actually are Machmir, all the Paiskim. The Lahakal in Anu Yuchelim Las Tzedek Maran. It's only a Chumre. You can't go against Maran Lahakal. So this is the first source for this Klal that supposedly is the Shita of the Sfardim. And as Yaakov Chaim Sefer describes there, and from his Ma'arim HaKaimis, this turned instantly into the official shita of the Paiskim in Eretz Yisrael. He lived in Eretz Yisrael, Rabbi El-Ghazi, and also other countries nearby. It's only all of a sudden, after he wrote that, all of a sudden you see this class spreading through all their shuvas. They all say, you can never be makel according to Maran if it's an issue of Erva, Kedushin, Gerushin, Yibum Chalitza. it goes on there by Arichas. And then, he quotes from a Rav by the name of Chaim Avram Gagen, who's Be'arach, the generation of the Tzemach Tzedek. He was also Rishon LeZion, after, maybe 100 years or less after Yotav Al-Ghazi. In his Shalos and Shuvas Chukei Chaim, he was asked regarding a mikveh where there were two bayros and there was a hole, and the hole had a Dover Makabel Tumah. They closed it with a Dover Makabel Tumah. So he quotes one Rav who wanted to say that you're going to say that it's Zeichlin because when it's open, the mikveh fills up and overflows, but the mikveh holds Mem Sa'ah. So das Ruba de Rabvasa, according to most Paiskim, if it is Zchila from the mikveh, but the mikveh always holds 40 sa'ah, the Zchila isn't a problem. The Ramah and Shulchan Aruch says the Yesh Machmirim. That's what I wanted to say. That's just Machmirim to close it, to try to stop the Zchila. But maybe you could put a davar on the kabel tumah. Maybe the Ramah would be made, and he turned into like a triple suffix, right? As far as the Paiskim, they're into making sfek svekas and triple svekas. Do we hold like this one? Do we hold like that one? We don't know. So Avram Chaim Gagan responds and says that Achara Mechila Rabba, after asking Mechila from you for Chaim Avram Gagan, after asking my Mechila, you're wrong. How can you make sveikas when you have a klotter psak? Because the mechaber, when it comes to havayas hamikveh b'davar makabel tumah, if it's mamish, you're making the mikveh with davar makabel tumah, that's in sifnei chas. Paskin like the Rosh, that has to be shalei b'davar makabel tumah. That I think that was one of the sveikas that I wanted. Do we paskin like the Rosh? Do we not? What do you mean? Do we paskin like the Rosh? It's clear, modern. And when it comes to manias apisol, preventing psol, like here. You have Sifnun, and Sifnun, weiter, it says, the Mechaber writes, Bistam, like the Shita, that you should not be saying with the Davar Makabel Tumah. So what are you going to say? The one thing that the Maran was matir is that, according to the Mechaber, if there's 40 Sa'ah, then we don't care about Zechila, that the Zechila isn't the problem. However, the Ramah is Machmer, and he quotes Yotav Al-Ghazi. Yotav Al-Ghazi wrote in that Tshuva, that you do it, leniencies are ever begitten, say, all the chumras. Only the hakol you can go against the Maran. So that's what Rebbe Chaim Sefer is doing. He has a separate section, like what else is considered part of erva. So, right, he wrote, Yotav Al-Ghazi wrote, Kedushin, Gerushin, Yibam, and Chalitza. And now you have this Chaim Avram Gagan saying, he said, B'davar sheba erva, me'ach shekach, misam pela adam, las sfek sveika, but piske Maran. Who are you to make a sfek sveika on things that Maran already paskin? If Maran is macher because bein b'havayas hamikveh, bein b'menil psul, and even about the mem sa'ah, the Ramah is machmer. And we just said that Yotav Al-Ghazi said the be'isa erva anu toifsin kol chumnis v'im kain gam be'inyan taras hamikveh chashav iser erva l'tar isha l'bayla me'iser kares. So all of a sudden he's expanding it now to mikvahs also, which Rebbe Chaim Sefer brings other Mekayos after that who also seem to agree to that idea. So that's just an interesting topic related to this question of Ari Machmer, Ari not, and how Chaim Avram Gagan took it to the extreme that it's considered Davar Sheba Erva, you should be Machmer, Gedas, Kol HaPaiskim, even against the Mechaber of Shulchan Aruch. That's the long Hakdama. And I want to get back just briefly to begin the topic that I wanted to actually discuss. Just I'm going to mention one makar, and we'll leave the rest for part two. So in the recent generations, once plumbing became widespread, so it seems that around the year 1900 Be'arach, that's when the Sfarim start discussing this question in Gaya Mikveh. So in Europe already you have the Marsham, you have the Beis Yitzchak, you have the Imre Yosher that discuss it. I'm not going to get into it because I want to focus more on America. The Aruch HaShulchan, there's Aruch HaShulchan, Seminary Aleph, Sif Kuf Samach Tes. He mentions the Pashtas, Mamish, like very casually, that you can use the plumbing and just make sure that the pipe is right. But it's not clear to what extent it actually caught on and was widespread in Europe itself. There's also a parallel discussion going on by the Sfardim, and I'll mention that later in part two when we get to discussing how this issue actually just came back up again earlier this year. But Benegea, United States, it seems like it really spread far and wide, to the extent that it seems like it turned into the standard in the United States. However, it's not like we have a ton of data from a ton of places. I'm sure more research might turn up more information, if it's even possible to still research and find out what things were like 75 years ago, etc. Now, generally, when it comes to this topic, I'm relying a lot on an article written by someone by the name of Yossi Azos, who seems to belong to some kind of like a liberal Sephardi group that part of their thing is that they don't, even if you have certain Yesodis and like basic halacha l'maisa, the way halacha is practiced today, you have a certain shnit among the Sephardim that say that, our poskim 100 years ago, lavdafka, they were makabel, these basic, it could be electricity on Shabbos, things like that. So that seems to be kind of the background where he's coming from with this article and why he sort of wrote it up. He's, in essence, being very sympathetic to this practice in the United States. That's not the reason why I'm going through it. It's just I think it's an interesting topic. So I did rely a lot on his research. Also other articles that touch on issues relating to this. So the first makar that I saw is from the year Tafresh Nun Chas, 1898, which is pretty early. In Eastern European immigration to the United States, 1890s is relatively the beginning of when the big immigration started. The first Chashav Lubavitchers, someone asked once, who were the first Lubavitchers to settle in the United States and when did they come? The first ones came in during the 1890s, late 1890s. The first Chabad Beis Medrash maybe is from a few years earlier, the late 1880s. So this is, Tafresh Nun Ches 1898 is pretty early on with this. So in that year, there's a sefer printed in the United States called Mikvah Yisrael. As we shall see, as we've seen, there are a lot of Sfarma mikvahs that are called Mikvah Yisrael. So this is, the idea of this sefer was, there was another collection where he has the dinim and the pnim, basic dinim of mikvah and the pnim, with a short pirush and a long pirush, like you find with a lot of Sfarma mikvahs. So this sefer Mikvah Yisrael was printed by, it says in the Sharblat, Tzvi Grodzensky, Tzvi Hirsch Grodzensky, he's related to Reb Chaim Eiser. Rav the Kehilas Kodesh Amaha, Asher b'Medinos America Tzvainis. Back then also you had many more Orthodox Jewish communities spread through all kinds of cities throughout the United States. A lot of them disappeared. So he was the Rav in Omaha. It was printed, Omaha, Nebraska. It was printed in a Jewish press, Jewish printing press in Chicago. There's actually sort of a haskama from Rabbi Shraga Spector, who was still alive then. It's not, it's the kind of haskama where it says, I don't write haskamas and I didn't read your sefer, but it's still worth something. Anyway, and Tzvi Grodzensky is, if you want to find out more about him and other Rabbanim from that era, there's a website, kvarim.com, that has a lot of basic facts about a lot of these early American Rabbanim and where they're buried and things like that. So this sefer is actually considered a relatively serious sefer in the Tchum mikvahs, and you'll find it still quoted today in various Sfarim. So if you look in Anaf Shlishi, the third chapter, which deals with the dinim of Shuvim, and Se'ev Vav, this is what he writes. The context there is discussing Sif Dal and Shulchan Aruch about the nemanos of a guy, of a yid, that whole issue. This is what he writes. Mikvahs shalanu, our mikvahs, hanasim poibim dinasina that are done in this country. Ayadei hamayim habohim mehanor, ayadei silainus, the water that comes from the river through pipes, through plumbing. Ukamat reiva ir, ein lehem mayim acherim rak elu. And in fact, most of the city has no other source of water. The only source of water is tap water. He adds on the side, back in 1898, you may still have had a well in your yard, but they only use it for laundry. And there's no tircha, because all you need to do is fill the mikveh is open the faucet. What's the tircha? That's all you have to do. So then there's no chash, even if it belongs to a guy, because what's the guy going to do? He's not going to open the faucet. He's going to go down to the river and bring buckets. I mean, it's now the mikvahs are made straight from the faucet. That's the only possible way anyone normal would think of filling the mikveh. So he's not even discussing the question of how it's mutter. It's mamash pashtos that it changes the whole din of Namanos, that there can never be a problem with your mikvah. The next sefer, I'll stop by introducing, I'll conclude by introducing the next makar, which we can discuss in part 2. There's a sefer Mei Gava, which actually is not mainly about mikvahs. It mainly just has drashas and whatever, from someone by the name of Rabbi Gedalia, Rabbi Chiel Halpern, Migeza, Baal Sidra Doidus, it says this all in the Sharblat, and he writes in the Sharblat that he was a Rav in Toledo, Ohio, Fort Worth, Texas, Portland, Oregon, and now, when the sefer is being printed, he's in Seattle, Washington. This is printed in the year Adaras, 1914, printed in New York. So, like I said, mostly Drushim, but on page 50 and on, there's actually a Shaila Utshuva B'dvar Mikvah, and this is maybe the first argument, the first disagreement that came up, where there was a back and forth about Mikvah in Seattle, Washington, and there's actually a Lubavitcher Rav, one of those who came, maybe the earliest one who came in the 1890s, and we'll discuss the details and the other Makaidas in part 2.
Yeah.